there's some places, and in fact some of the trees we'll look at today will bear evidence of 15 or 20 different fires, or more than that. An individual living tree that bears that evidence of that much fire activity. And suffice it to say that fire has created a very intricate mosaic across our landscape, and that's something that we've come to learn about, and it actually presents probably our biggest ecological restoration challenge for us. Some of the things that we know about the history of fire and what we've come to call our fire regime here in the park, there are things like, well, how much fire was there? How much area burned per year? How big were those fires? How often did those fires occur, or how long between those fires? How intense were those fires? How much energy were they kicking out? And secondly, closely related to that, how much heat were they driving down into the soil? We call that fire severity. How severe were those fires? That's really what dictates the impact of fire on the vegetation and the soils. So that's a very important thing for us to understand. Secondly, well, again, what time of year did these fires occur? That makes a big difference, again, on the impact on the plants and soils. And finally, well, where did all this fire come from? So those are some of the questions that we've been researching, started in the late 1970s, thanks to some very forward-thinking plant ecologists, or one. And we spent 10 or 15 years, we're still doing research into this, because there's always more to learn. We've tied in with many different universities on this kind of work. Some of our own staff have gone on to do their master's and PhD work in this field. And then other agencies, or like the Foothills Model Forest, now called the Foothills Research Institute, we've had a major focus on learning more about the role of natural disturbance in our plant communities and the implications of that on wildlife and various other things. So through all of that, we've come to have a pretty good understanding. I don't think we know it all, but we know plenty enough that we can be actively managing and moving ahead. Some of the things that we've learned are that we have a very good record in the tree rings. The tree rings dendrochronology provides us a great record, quite accurate record, of what's been going on for as far back as 500 years. That's pretty solid. And we've looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of cross-sections of trees and fire scars and built those into maps that they're almost like layers on an onion that show us how different areas burned at different times, how these fires overlapped with each other in time and in space, and it's given us a good picture of the overall amount of land that burned historically. We can go back farther into the record by looking at bog cores and other sources of information, carbon layers and things like that. There's no real indication that there was much difference. I mean, there's fluctuations for sure with climate, but there always was a lot of fire in this ecosystem. Generally true right across Canada. But what we have learned is that on average, and there's no such thing as an average here, but if you took those 500 years, leveled it all out, averaged the area out, it would tell us that about 42 square kilometers of Jasper National Park burned each year. That's a lot of land. It wasn't all forest either. A surprising amount of that was in the lower elevation grasslands, aspen forest, open Douglas fir and pine forest. They're almost savanna type vegetation communities. They were maintained that way by the frequency of fire. So that brings us to the frequency, the cycle of fire, and it was particularly frequent. Our grasslands burned probably every 5 to 10 years. In the lower elevations of the park, aspen stands and open Douglas fir, pine, maybe 25 to 35, sometimes 50-year cycles. Again, quite frequent. Moving up the sides into the lower subalpine, That shifted, the cycles lengthened to maybe 100 years, and as we get into the upper subalpine and the cooler, moisture areas, cycles of 350 years are not uncommon. So, and as you might anticipate, the more frequent the fires are, what do you think the implications are for the intensity and severity? Less. Yeah, exactly. The more frequent the fires, the lower the intensity, the lower the severity, and why is that? Yeah, there isn't very much time for that fuel to keep accumulating. Biomass accumulates in the northern hemisphere for sure. Fire is probably the greatest, or one of the greatest recyclers of it, along with decomposition. But not very much fuel can actually build up between fires when the fires are more frequent. So fire has a different characteristic down low than when it's every 350 years. When it gets dry enough to burn, I'll tell you, that's hot. And it's going right down to mineral soil, except in a few microsites. You know, that's very intense, very severe fire. We also learned a lot about the frequency of fire, and this is where we get down to microscopes. But you can look at those annual tree rings and actually see what part of the tree ring are fires occurring in. And that has told us that the vast majority of the fires in the lower elevations occurred in the springtime, which is pretty interesting because what we always thought of as the major source of ignition was lightning. We just don't have lightning in the mountains that early in the year. In the end of March, in April, and May, we don't get that kind of energy in the atmosphere till later on in June, July, and August. So where was that fire coming from? Well, it's obvious if we've been paying attention to the elders of the First Nations. They used fire for so many different reasons. They used fire a lot. They managed very actively this landscape where they lived. They burned for creating good grazing to attract wildlife. They burned for the advantage of species they used for medicines, for plants they used for foods, to make sure there was a good supply of firewood handy, always standing dead trees. Many, many reasons that they burned. They used fire against their enemy. They used fire against the Europeans as we moved. There's good stories. I worked in Elk Island for 3 years. Good stories from around early Fort Edmonton when things weren't going so well. I think that's why us white guys lived in the fort. But they used their fire tool at a different season of year. They went around and did their burning in the fall around Fort Edmonton. Those guys had a pretty hungry winter. So did their horses. I think they ate their horses. But so fire can be used in many different ways. We have lots to learn from all of this, but the big lesson is that I guess that we have several fire regimes. It's not just one size fits all. When we're thinking about restoring fire, putting fire back in that landscape, there's a really strong onus on us to understand that and put that into practice. Burning is not enough. We have to be burning at the right time of year. We need to be burning when the weather is consistent with getting the right kind of intensity and severity so that we don't have effects on the plants and the soils that are outside of that kind of bounds that they're adapted to. Everything here is adapted to fire. Virtually all the plants, the wildlife in turn. But if we're using fire in a, what I would call it, irresponsible sort of way, we can be doing some harm here, where we really intend to be doing good. But I think our prescriptions are designed to take these criteria into effect. So, yeah, First Nations people, humans were a cause of a lot of this fire. That's one part of the ecosystem that has been difficult to replace. Those people aren't here, they're not doing their thing. So we are working with those people to replicate what they've been doing for thousands of years here, and that knowledge, that traditional knowledge, is informing our burning practices. So springtime is a busy time of year for us. But also the other way that we can work to getting fire back in the landscape, other than planned prescribed burns, is that we can manage those wildfires, those random ignitions, whether it's a human cause from a careless campfire or an escape from a RV that's burning in the ditch along the highway or a lightning ignition. It doesn't really matter. We have developed options for managing those fires. We've zoned our park so that we understand where our values at risk are. Impacting people and property is still a huge issue for us. We have to accommodate that. People and property have to be safe. So we've zoned our park. But from that we've learned that we don't have high values everywhere in the park. There's lots of places where a random ignition fire could be managed in a different way other than throwing the kitchen sink at it, which is what we did for a good 75 years. Fire was bad. Smokey Bear told us that. Bambi reinforced that message really strongly. The answer is put those fires out. That's why the Warden Service was created 100 years ago. Catch the poachers, put out those darn fires. That's your two main jobs. And we got really good at that. And we were quite successful. That average area burned went down to less than a hectare per year. Some whole decades less than a couple of hectares. We were very effective. We pushed the science, the technology. With the invention of fire pumps, portable fire pumps, then came aircraft, electronic lightning detection systems, helicopters, initial attack. We got really good at this. Not to say that that technology and that expertise is bad. That's probably brought us the best and biggest tools that we use in prescribed burning. We still have fires that we have to suppress and manage and put out for the safety of people to prevent fires from escaping the park into the industrial forest that surrounds us. But those same techniques, the knowledge, the weather forecasting, all of that goes into good prescribed burning practices. So that's, I guess, something that Parks Canada has led the way in a bit. Many other agencies, BC's doing great work in prescribed burning. Alberta is coming on like crazy. They're doing more and more prescribed burning.